Welcome to our session on our veteran superintendents, still a thing. My name is Ann Wicks. I lead the Education Opportunity Team at the George W. Bush Institute, and I am delighted to be joined up here by some pretty insightful and experienced district leaders who will share their perspective on this. And what should this role look like, and what have the last 2-ish years done to the superintendents around the country, and what should we do about that as we look forward, as we continue through and hopefully beyond COVID-19. So I am joined by Alberto Carvalho, who has just made the move from Miami to Los Angeles, so in his new Southern California hometown. Mike Miles, who was formerly the superintendent of Dallas ISD and is now the CEO of Third Future Schools, which is some charters in Colorado and Texas. And then Dr. Brenda Cassellius, who is in Boston, will be leaving at the end of the school year from her role leading in Boston Public Schools. And finally, Dr. Barbara Jenkins, who's the superintendent in Orange County, Florida, one of those big Florida county districts. Okay, I wasn't really expecting all the hometown cheering, but I'm sort of loving that. It's like March Madness turned into superintendent conversation. And what I didn't say is Barbara announced that she'll be leaving her role at the end of the year, right? Calendar year, is that correct? And to retire. So you've got a mix of folks up here who have announced that they're leaving, someone who's left and gone down to something else, and then a superintendent who left one frying pan and jumped directly into another frying pan. So I think they'll have some good perspective for y'all today. Okay, so let's just get started with kind of maybe the big, simple question. The world of public education has always been intense and complicated. The last 2 years have ratcheted that up considerably. District leaders were, in addition to everything you all do, right, you became public health officials overnight with oftentimes conflicting or little guidance. The families you serve, the kids you serve, went under incredible stress in lots of different ways. And you all were the ones in charge. The proverbial buck was stopping with you. So is the superintendent role doable as it's currently constructed? Is it possible to be successful, or is it a get in, do as much as you can in 2 years or 3 years, and then get out with your body and soul intact? So I know, we'll frame it that way, right? We'll frame it that way to get it going. So any of you want to jump in? What do you think? Is this a doable role?
I don't mind going first, 'cause then I don't have to try to keep remembering what I was going to say. I do believe it's doable. Here's the thing. It is certainly more difficult than it was in years past, but still doable. And I certainly cannot subscribe to this notion that you get in and do as much as you can and then get out, because if that is your strategy, it'll just be overturned as soon as you leave. So get in, do it quickly, doesn't work because the next superintendent and board overturn it all. So I think longevity is critical for the work, and I think it is still doable, but you have to have the heart, the fire, the passion. You got to have thick skin if you want to do the work.
Yeah, I would echo that, but I would also say that it is doable, but the work was difficult even before COVID in the last few years. It's always been a pretty untenable situation if you want to do transformative things. I think about the last 12 years, I think about John Daisy, Cammie Anderson, Dwight Jones, Chris Barbrick, and I was in that group, the reform superintendents, and most of them left pretty quickly, well, after 3 or 4 years, which is fairly quick. And if you want to do real transformative things, you're always going to fight the status quo bias. You're going to have a lot of media criticism. And so I'm of the camp where you get in, do some very systemic things for kids, do them systemically so they can't just be changed overnight, just like what we did in Dallas, and and don't bank on a long tenure as a superintendent.
Any other thoughts on that one?
Well, I think it's absolutely doable. It does take a bit of consternation on the part of a superintendent to get through all of the years and to be able to withstand the political winds that happened within the community. Certainly, a whole new set of work was put on our plate as superintendents the past 2 years, mitigating the effects of the pandemic, which I think took everybody by surprise. Nobody would have thought 2 years ago we would be shutting down the nation's schools, and that we would have to become experts in MERV 13s. Anybody out there, superintendent, not know what a MERV 13 or PPE was? I know I didn't. You know, there's always opportunity if you are able to sustain and have a strong strategic direction and have the political will be behind you to get the work done that needs to get done.
Well, I hope for the sake of American public education and democracy, superintendents continue to be viable and relevant, right? And I say that with all the respect that the position deserves, but at the same time recognizing that in many instances, the viability of superintendents, or not, is a responsibility of the superintendents themselves. So we blame a lot on the media and unions and the economy and immigration and poverty and whatever else. And you know what? I have little control over all of that. But I absolutely have control over what happens between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. in thousands of sites across the community where whatever we do can actually elevate the dignity, the humanity, quality of life, quality of instruction. And if that gets noticed at the right time, by the right people, for the right reasons, then the viability of superintendents actually increases. However, if after a little bit of heat or pressure, we bail out, 2-3 years out, and decide to go make the big money in the private sector, then maybe that's great. But the question is, how much did you do for public education? So I say that respectfully. I've been superintendent for 15 years in my first gig, and crises, yeah, but there were crises, as you said, before the pandemic. Like having your community half destroyed by a hurricane, or many hurricanes, 12,000 immigrant kids not speaking English, arriving, not over time, but just one single year, right? Certainly COVID being one, or having a target on your back for advocating for reasonable science-endorsed practices when you're constantly being threatened by a state body. But if you are determined, and in fact, you're about the kids, then the shouts and the insults from the adults should really not matter much and should not drive any superintendent out of their positions.
It gets a little noisy, the adults, sometimes when in this work, right? And I think context matters enormously, sort of what you bring, right? I know, Brenda, you came from the Midwest. Mike, you came into Dallas from Colorado. Alberto, we talked about you coming from one beach to the next now. How do you manage that? How do you drop in effectively as a superintendent into a new ecosystem when you're the new kid, right? And there's lots of adult politics potentially that are entrenched. What does that look like? How do you do that well? What gets in the way?
I think that, you know, coming from the Midwest and going to the East Coast in Boston was a little bit of a shock, you know, Minnesota nice that you get, and then going to the East Coast, and they can tend to be a little sharp.
A little more bare-knuckled there.
Yeah, I think they're a little hard on themselves, though. But I think the first thing that superintendents do, and I think most superintendents do this just instinctively anyways, is to listen to the community and to really spend time within the community, build those strategic partnerships that you need, and get a couple of quick wins to build your credibility, and then have some validators out there within the community who help to build the credibility to introduce you to the community, and so that the community then begins to adopt you as one of their own.
Alberto, anything that you're doing here in LA to learn this ecosystem, learn this content?
Well, over the past 40 days, yeah, you know, in as much as these are very different communities on literally different parts of the country, there's so much recognizable connective tissue across the community. So the struggle in a classroom faced by a teacher is exactly the same. The level of the poverty down to the percentage point is exactly the same, Miami or Los Angeles. The size, relatively speaking, LA used to be much bigger. Right now, about the size of the district is very similar. Demographic profile of Hispanic, Latino versus Black versus white, non-Hispanic student, very, very similar. So the conditions are very recognizable, very identical. And therein lies actually the opportunity. I'm not just speaking about Miami, but there are other districts across the country, or collections of schools or portfolios of publicly funded education that are producing wildly, vastly different results with very similar demographic profile populations. So what's the difference? One thing I know for certain is that the DNA makeup of kids in Miami or LA is exactly the same, meaning they have the same ability, the same potential. So it's not about kids being broken, it's about systems of adults actually breaking their dreams and aspirations. So the noise in LA, not that I've seen any thus far, is going to be the noise. And it's going to come at you in English, in Spanish, and a few dialects, and that's great. But I think effective leadership, and I'm speaking about them, not me, elevates the right noise above the noise and makes that noise the good noise, surrounded by the good trouble that kids actually need. This idea of, going along to get along and playing it safe so that everybody loves you usually results in low graduation rates, low post-secondary placement, low reading, literacy, numeracy, proficiency, meaning you didn't make enough of a fight for that which matters, and the results followed. So, different place, very similar circumstances. I know the unions are much tougher in California, but that should not be the detrimental issue either. LA is going to be the highest performing urban district in America, and that's why I went to LA. And I say that with all the love and respect for Miami, but I'm LA now, so I don't remember the Miami Heat. I don't remember the Miami Dolphins. I'm all about the Rams and the Lakers.
And I noticed your tie is almost Dodger blue, kind of Rams blue. Well done, well done.
So, Alberto, you're going to have to compete with Dallas Independent School District, who's already gotten all the achievement results you're going to hope to achieve. But
Miami was a broad-winning district. Dallas never was.
Well, I wasn't there when they were competing for Broad. I like the framing that you had. Let me frame it just a little bit different. I went from Colorado to Dallas, and I went from 11,000 students to 160,000 students. And what I would say is the systems are the same, and the students are the same. But the systems are similar across the country. And it's not communities that are broken, it's not teachers that are broken, it's not politics that are broken, it's the system that is failing public education. We can talk a lot more about that, but that's how I would frame it.
So Barbie, you've had a different experience as sort of been part of what I would call a chain of leadership in your district. You were in the district before you became its leader. And what did that give you as superintendent? What is that like to grow into a superintendent role that way?
So a couple of things come to mind. First, let me say my dear friend Alberto Carvalho did a phenomenal job in Miami, and it is leadership. We have to acknowledge leadership makes a huge difference, and he will be greatly missed in Florida, particularly by the governor. I will miss him because the governor's still there. So let me say, I actually spent 8 years in, I shouldn't have said that. This is being recorded, isn't it?
But you know what? You're retiring. You're retiring. Speak freely amongst friends.
I have 7 months. Nonetheless, let me tell you, I didn't spend all of my career in Central Florida. I actually left Orlando and went to Charlotte for 8 years. And a superintendent by the name of Ron Blocker, Alberto knows him, called me one day and said, "It's time to come home." And I said no, because I was content, and that second seat is very comfortable. He said, "Come and be my chief of staff. That's all I'm asking. Then I'm going to make you the deputy." I agreed to come eventually, and the deputy became a central core position with all of teaching and learning and all of the area superintendents reporting to it. And then he announced that he would be retiring in 2 years. Now, mind you, he waited until he made sure I had a mortgage, that I had actually relocated. And so I did not intend to be superintendent. I came to be his deputy. That is the sweet spot. If you're in the deputy role, that is a sweet spot. You get to really run the core business without the politics for the most part. And so I begged Ron not to retire. 2 years out, he announced it. But here's how he prepared me. He made sure I had every experience to be prepared to become the superintendent. So when they did a national search, he really set me up for success, and I'm grateful for that. The political realm, he made sure I was immersed in. I had to be the architect for the strategic plan the first time that the board and the superintendent were putting together a plan together, so that it was co-owned. He made me develop those board relationships. And then in the community, both philanthropic and business leaders got to know me because he continued to push me out there. And I think he did 12 years. I am in my 10th year. I think the longevity has to do with some succession planning and building that plan that the community and the board support.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit to talk about students. I'm going to take advantage of the perspective and experience you all have as we think about where to go next. So if you look forward to the next, let's call it decade, the kids who've been in the system when COVID hit now are making their way forward. I think the pandemic has been, I would call it, particularly merciless to children, and specifically merciless to children, particularly kids in poverty, kids who are English language learners, kids with disabilities, students whose parents were essential workers, who had a really different experience oftentimes through the pandemic. And we know we've had relief funds that have come into the districts to help mitigate, which seems like an imperfect word for what I know people are trying to do on campuses. And at the same time, Alberto, you mentioned this in LA, and we're seeing enrollment dropping, or we're having, as LA, you were talking about just recently about chronic absenteeism, which we're seeing around the country. And that impacts, of course, budgets. So that puts superintendents in an interesting spot, right, with some tough decisions coming ahead. As a superintendent, what do you wish you could do? What policy, what tool, what support, what would give you more agency and more ability to serve kids given what's happening, what you see coming? What do you want to do, or what do you wish you would be able to do that someone could clear the way to help reach more kids from your perspective? Anybody want to start? Brenda, you want to?
I would say, and there was nothing like the crisis, right, to force the nation to up its skill in terms of mastery of technology, particularly teachers, principals, leaders. But we're still far away from this 24/7, anytime, anywhere learning, where the intuitive and the intelligence, the technology, the will, the skill of educational systems actually meets students, every student, in an individualized, adaptable way, and elevates them towards their full academic potential by recognizing what they like, what they don't like, capitalizing on relevance to their own learning modality. I actually believe that technology exists, the content exists, the delivery systems exist, but the formalized way in which education is organized and funded prevents us from fully leveraging technology and systems as they exist today. So what would I like to see? I would like to see that reality where time and space dictated by policies that are both arcane and archaic should take a back row seat to the individual needs of students and the knowledge and technologies that currently exist to address their needs.
Does that mean funding following kids more than systems?
That's declared war to many people, but we certainly should absolutely discard this idea. You know, we speak a mean game of equity, and everybody has an opinion about equity, everybody has an opinion about education, and so many people around me say so much about equity in education that they actually believe they did something about either or both. In most cases, it is not what we observe, right? Everybody's got an opinion. This idea of 180 days of school for 7 hours and 20 minutes a day, marked by annoying as hell bells every 60 minutes, has to end. That's not the way people learn. That's not the way people are conditioned. All of the research is behind that. But with that said, it hasn't ended. Why? Because it makes sense not to the kids, but it makes sense to many adults. So if politicians who actually spend their time, their devotion, their talent, to the extent they have any, legislating over education policy, if they really understood the research behind it, they would fundamentally change the way educational organizations are assembled, the way education is funded, with the necessary flexibility to actually give rise to this, as I said, individualized and adapted way of teaching kids. And look, I'm not just speaking from a theoretical perspective. Till the last day I was a superintendent in Miami, I ran a school as a principal, a school where I also taught physics. So I taught physics, ran the school as principal, and I was superintendent. And this school was a school I started my first year as a superintendent. And we started the school by turning everything upside down. So no mandated seat time. The school day was as diverse as the student population. Yes, there the funding did follow the student. The school was a laboratory within the greater community. Teachers were not instructors, they were knowledge facilitators, actually making connections rather than dictating principles. And guess what? It worked. 100% graduation rate, attendance 100% most days, and no critical incidents, meaning you didn't need to police kids because they were there with a purposeful set of activities that engaged them, that touched them.
Mike, it sounds like a little bit what you created.
Yeah, so some things can be done within the system. For example, my opinion on equity, the number one thing you can do to make things more equitable for students, especially poor and minority students, is to have the highest performing teachers teach your lowest performing kids. And that doesn't take a lot of money, and yet we don't see a whole bunch of districts or school systems doing that. That's something that can be done, but I'm in a unique position here where I'm not a superintendent now, and I'm not in a traditional public education organization. I run a network of charter schools. And we are freed from some of those constraints. So during COVID, except for the 2 months, April and May, where the governor shut down the schools, and so that was a state order, we have never been closed, not one day in 2 years, not one day. We've had in-person synchronous learning. The year before, we had 15% of our families choose to be remote, but everybody else was there. And in person, we didn't lose any ground. We didn't have learning loss. We still scored 1.8 years of growth on the NWA MAP test last year and in this year. And we are approaching many of the things you're describing, Alberto, about learning anytime, anywhere, and lots of other things I can explain about our model. But it's a systemic change. We're able to do that because we are freed from some of the constraints that others have when you're in a traditional public school with a traditional board of education. The last thing I would say is that we also have a changed mindset, which I think our profession has gotten away from, and that is the sense that we are a critical, essential organization. We treated COVID like a police department or hospital. After first responders and police, we're essential. That's why we don't close. We don't even close on a snow day. We've never had a snow day in 5 years that this network has been in operation. That means teachers come, and not all of our kids will come, only 30% will come, or on a freeze days. In the state of Texas, a year ago, there was this national freeze, you probably heard about it, right? Every single school in Texas, it's a pretty big state, was closed except our school. Third Future School, the one that we have in Midland last year. They were open 4 days. Only 80 or 90 kids came, but 80 or 90 kids got an education. They also got food. They also got warmth. We're essential.
Brenda, what would you do?
Yeah, I think mine is a bit more practical. I think we need a caring and competent teacher in every single classroom, and we need it this fall. I'm extremely worried about the labor shortage. that we have going on. You know, obviously this panel is about superintendents, but I'm really, really worried about our educators and having enough of them and having enough that are actually competent to do the job, to address the diverse students' body that we all love. And so if I could wave my policy wand, it would be free education for all educators, and that we do that now at the federal level, and that we absorb all of their debt right now to retain them, and we invest heavily in their professional development, in equitable practices and the kind of innovation that Alberto is talking about as well.
I'll be very brief. My colleagues have certainly covered most things that I would have mentioned. The teacher pipeline is critical. So I love Brenda's thoughts around how we build that pipeline so that young people want to go into the profession. Secondly, I think we have to take advantage of technology. Pandemic forced us to do some things that were outside of the normal, and we should not have this rush back to normalcy. It was not serving all children to begin with. And so we have to take advantage of what technology has given us an opportunity to do differently in public education. Thirdly, I think sustained funding is still going to be a necessity. When the funding cliff comes from the federal government, there will be no funds to replace those dollars, and so schools will again be under stressful regrouping. And so I would like to see sustained funding. And then lastly, early childhood education has to be earmarked as critical. Children come to us with huge gaps. We've got to do something about making sure there's quality preschool and early literacy.
Well, let's make a little, you've heard some good ideas about this, but a shift to how do we measure some of this? It might not surprise you, at the George W. Bush Institute, we care a lot about assessment and accountability. We sort of lead with that in the name, it's no mystery. And I'd love to hear what you all think about what's the right kind of accountability? What should we expect from our public education system? Barbara, we'll start with you since you were at the end that time, but what should we expect from the system? What's the right way for the rest, all the public dollars going in with our collective children? What should that look like?
I support an accountability system. We were given grave advice that all of this money being invested from the federal government better not blow it. The concern is you've got the dollars and you can't find the manpower. Can't find the bodies to actually provide mental health counselors and teachers that we need. So, but 100% we agreed we need to be accountable. And I want standardized testing as well. It just needs to be the appropriate standardized testing. And I need growth measure counting just as well as proficiency for those children that are significantly behind. What we should expect is that for every child that we serve, they have at a minimum 1 year of growth. What we want for those children that are underserved is more than 1 year of growth. You can't catch children up if you slow them down, if you remediate and never teach at grade level. And so we want significant growth for underserved populations so that we can see those achievement gaps closing. I support standardized testing.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
Yes. In 2019, 34% of all 8th graders in America could read at grade level. And that's a bad enough statistic, but in 1998, 21 years earlier, 32% were proficient on the NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress. You can argue about the test, but you can take any other test and it'll be very similar. Worse than that, in 2019, 15% of black 8th graders could read at grade level. Even worse than that, in 1998, it was 13%. If you are not looking at the achievement gap as a metric you should tackle, I think that's part of the main job of a superintendent of educational leaders. Whatever metric, whatever test you want to use the STAR exam, use the CMAS, use PARCC, whatever, but take a look at that. But there's one other thing I would say, another metric we should all be looking at, and that is the year 2035 competencies gap. Because while kids need to rewrite and do math, and we need to close that gap, there's another gap growing, and that is year 2035 competencies. Information literacy, critical thinking, problem solving, learning how to learn. Those are things we should also be measuring. My network, we're measuring it. Every kid, we're a K-8 network. Every kid, 2nd grade through 8th grade, takes an art of thinking course that has those things in it: communications, information literacy, problem solving, and we're taking assessments to measure their strength in it.
I'll chime in very quickly. Actually, I think as far as accountability is concerned, as a country, we are in a better place than we were 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago. And I think the tweaks that are necessary are not as significant as the shifts that we must see in terms of governance, funding, and the actual structure of schooling. And I say that because, and he mentioned it, I have to confess, I am a governor of the National Assessment Governing Board, so I'm responsible for NAEP policy. That is the gold standard. The thing is that not every district in every state participates. But that is a very effective way of actually reporting to the nation what progress over time has been, what the gap has been over time, particularly for 4th and 8th graders and 12th graders to a certain extent. And not just reading and math, but actually technology as well, even the arts. I also believe that an effective accountability system, beginning with a national sort of umbrella through NAEP, each state, not following any national standard, obviously needs to have its own accountability system. There were many things I disagreed with in places where I've worked, but the accountability system in the state of Florida in terms of the standards themselves and an annual assessment was strong. And I worked in Florida over a number of different administrations. Where I think we begin to lose ground is the variability of progress monitoring tools that are easily understood by the stakeholders and allow more than just the end-of-year autopsy result. Providing data, real-time data that allows you to pivot, to recalibrate your teaching with effective reports to the community of stakeholders. That's where we're not quite there yet, and the variability across the nation is high, the variability within states is high, the variability within individual districts, and I have to say, LA being one, where the level of decentralization and autonomy may make a great deal of sense to the adults, but considering the level of mobility that families and students experience may not be so great for students. So another way of saying what I just said is a measured balance between high-stakes accountability with organic, fewer, better assessments that provide necessary inputs, not just once a year, but throughout the year, affording ultimately what accountability is supposed to provide in the system, which is improved teaching and learning. So baseline assessments and data, and then a series of interim assessments, not intrusive, that allow the communities to know where the progress towards goal is and how to pivot, recalibrate the practice, and also where to deploy the human resource development, the professional development on a timely basis should be going towards.
Hey, Ann, can I offer just a little bit of a different perspective than my colleagues, who I really respect? 20 years plus, 2 decades, we have been trying out this accountability model, and our gaps have widened. We've been giving more and more tests, and our gaps have widened. I think it's time for our approach to shift and to really rethink accountability and assessment and what type of assessments we use. I believe that they are biased, and they're racially biased, and I think that we need child psychologists who can look at this, because at such an early age, we tell kids they're not reading, and their parents think they're reading, and they think they're reading, and I wonder what that does to them psychologically and their own self-esteem. So I think we need to really think differently about the psychological impact of telling young black and brown kids that they can't read, and then they get taken out from their regular teacher. They go into a smaller group of students, learn from a paraprofessional who's less trained, and the Bluebird group, and then they don't get the kind of expertise that they need. So when I was Commissioner of Education in Minnesota, I asked, why is it we test kids so early at grades 3 in math and reading? And I was told, where is the research base? I asked congressmen, their staffers, nobody could tell me what the research base was for why we do this. other than because Texas did it. And I think it's time for us to have a really steep research base with psychologists, psychometricians, educators who get together and really look at our assessment systems and figure out what we do and then what level of accountability is needed to our parents, to our public, to our legislatures, to our Congress, and to our leaders.
We'll have a longer conversation over drinks about assessment. Everyone's favorite thing to do. I do, but yeah, I mean, I think this is a complicated issue about what do we know about how to do this. All right, in our last few minutes here, I want you each to answer kind of a two-parter as we go through. I'd love to know what measure or metric are you paying attention to right now? The world's changing pretty fast. What are you paying attention to in your work that's about students? I'm assuming it could be something else. And then the second part of that is what is giving you hope right now? This is a complicated time. What gives you hope every day? Barbara, I'll start with you.
Probably the measure that I'm most concerned about has to do with student achievement and learning gaps, underserved populations, and how do we super accelerate that learning. That is the measure most noteworthy. We had some narrowing of achievement gaps, and as soon as you start to learn the rules of the game changes, the test changes, the standards change, and then the gaps persist. And so I am doubly interested in how we narrow and eliminate achievement gaps. Because we have to teach our children where they are, and they've got to be able to compete in the world that they live in. And so I don't want to soft pedal this notion that they have to become proficient. That is our job. Here's what gives me hope. We have phenomenal principals. My leadership team is so dynamic. We've got dedicated teachers who are willing to do the work. They stood strong during a pandemic and just kept coming back for our children. That gives me hope. But more than them, our young people give me hope. I have a student advisory council. They are just brilliant. And anytime you're having a bad day, go and talk to some of our bright young teenagers. They give you hope for tomorrow because I think they'll get some things right that this generation has failed in. My LGBTQ advisory group I met with last week, they are just phenomenal. So our young people give me hope.
That's great. Brenda?
I'm measuring chronic absenteeism and graduation readiness, the students' GPAs, and looking at that, making sure that they're not failing their courses so that they can get ready and have everything that they need for graduate. Those are the things that I'm really looking at. What gives me hope is, again, the students. I think this is a group of students, this generation and the generation right behind them, are so well connected, so knowledgeable in ways that I never was as a third or fourth or fifth grader, you know. And so don't make me go up against a fifth grader anytime soon. But they're very connected and they understand their place in the world and their responsibility for it. And they're gonna hold us accountable for ruining things. And so I think that, you know, I'm really hopeful about our kids. And I don't go see the seniors, I actually go to the kindergarten classroom.
Mike, how about you?
Everything they said, we're outcomes focused, so academic outcomes is something we look for all the time. On the hope front, in one of our schools we have a big room with just windows for walls, and it's our dance class. It's right in the front of the building, and that was done purposely because all the things you have to deal with, I know there are a lot of things that could depress you, like at the school. I was at that school a few days, or last week, and the principal was dealing with a kid who had filmed another kid in the restroom, and then sending it out on social media, and that just, it's just so heartbreaking for all people concerned. But then you turn around and you see all these kids dancing in this room. It's the dance room. And it's just fun to see kids learning how to dance. So that gives me hope. And the second thing is this. I was in Phoenix a week ago or 2 weeks ago, and they're working on legislation. And there's this lady, Julia Meyerson, who runs some charter schools there, and a community funder, activist or advocate, Jim Swanson. And we were talking about challenges in education, and they're trying to pass legislation to help. And I had an out-of-body experience. I was just sitting there listening to Julia and Jim. They were discussing, despite the challenges, what they were going to try to do to help move the ball forward and get kids the education that they deserve. And I thought at that moment, that is the hope, that there are people behind the scenes. They're not going to get any credit. They don't know I'm talking about them, but they're not going to get any credit, no reward, nothing. They're just people in small groups just trying to help education, and it's happening probably all across the country. Good people with the will to move education forward. That's the hope.
Why don't you, Alberto, you can let us know, close us out.
Yeah, so what keeps me up at night literally is, I have the same concerns. You know, we have a chronic absenteeism problem across America and certainly in LA. We have a widening achievement gap that has widened over the past 2 years faster and wider than at any other time previously in the history of our country. But that does not keep me up at night, because we actually have solutions for that. And it's no longer a skill set deficit. It's not that we don't know how to fix that. It's a will set conundrum, is that we have the political courage to actually do what needs to be done. What keeps me up is actually the political structure around schools and schooling in cities and counties and states, is that we are at a point right now that we should all be concerned about this. You know, worry less about fixing schools, empower people who have a track record of fixing schools, but while they're doing that, let's fix all the other stuff. That is the biggest threat, existential threat to the America that we love. And I say that respectfully as an American by choice, not by chance. With that said, the hopeful piece, 2040. You know, kids being born across the country today will graduate high school in 2040. And what I'm saying, and this was sort of echoed earlier, the day we stop thinking about public education as K-12 or pre-K-12, and we actually develop the systems of support that eliminate the gap from ever building, meaning at birth, with a parent academy that provides the parents the skill set, the support from birth, then your graduation rate will go up, your achievement gaps will be non-existent, your prison pipeline will deteriorate or vanish. There are ways of doing this if we do it smarter rather than simply throwing money at it. And by the way, I want to clarify one thing I said earlier. I believe in accountability, but my last statement was fewer, better assessments. Technologies exist today where you can determine the literacy level, the numeracy level of a child through a single assessment. That should not necessarily be pencil and paper. It can be done. I just don't know how to run a system, how to know whether a gap exists or not without the assessment itself.
Well, there you have it. Please join me in thanking these incredible leaders, both for their service and their insight. Thank you all.